Thank you, Candles. It's truly an honor to be with you because Eva Moses Kor is one of my forgiveness heroes. To forgive as she has forgiven truly has been an inspiration to me, and she has been truly a shining light in the world for good. And so much of that is her message of forgiveness. That will be my topic today, entitled Forgiveness Education as a Path to Peace. And we have these 4 objectives for us tonight. First of all, unhealthy anger or resentment, which truly can build up when you're treated terribly unfairly, is an important challenge to mental and physical health. Second, we're going to take a look at this. If forgiveness can reduce or eliminate unhealthy anger, then we have to examine what forgiveness is and is not. So we're going to examine the meaning of forgiveness, because a lot of people use the word but don't really understand it. Then we'll look at some of the benefits which occur when people engage in forgiving others. One of the benefits is it can give you robust health. In the film Forgiving Dr. Mengele, we see Eva Moses Kor in her elderly years running vigorously on a treadmill. How could she do that if she had such pain in her heart weighing her down? You could see that that pain was lifted in the running, just in the running. That was such a simple and profound image of dear Eva being lifted out of the prison of resentment. And then we're going to ask, how do we actually go about forgiving others? And then at the end, I'm going to have a little surprise video for you, presuming our technology works. So with regard to our first objective, that unhealthy anger that builds up from unjust treatment from others actually can compromise psychological health. Let's just look at this one publication. It's a review of the literature and what's called a meta-analysis, where the authors looked at 24 studies altogether concerning youth or adolescents. And they showed a relationship between what they called irritability, or what others call toxic anger or resentment, and mental health challenges. And I quote, "We found that irritability forms a distinct dimension with substantial stability across time, and that it is specifically associated with depression and anxiety in longitudinal studies." In other words, when people have been treated unjustly by others, they can develop this irritability, and it stays with them for many, many years to come. We also see studies that link unhealthy anger to physical problems. For example, in this one particular study you see here in the year 2000, and I quote, "extremely low anger scores." In other words, you're suppressing the anger, and there's a lot of it. Now, extremely low anger scores have been noted in numerous studies of patients with cancer. Such low scores suggest suppression, repression, or restraint of anger that is built up in the heart and it hasn't been released. There's evidence to show that suppressed anger can be a precursor to the development of cancer and also a factor in its progression after diagnosis. But then also we see that this kind of anger that stays with a person is intense and abides, impacts the immune system. And when that happens, a person is more prone to all kinds of different issues, such as flus and asthma, skin diseases, and even arthritis. So unhealthy anger, think of it as an effect of being treated terribly by other people. You see, the injustice might have happened 20 years ago, but the effect, once it tumbles into a person's heart, can remain there for the rest of the person's life, so that the effects of being treated unjustly sometimes are even worse than the unjust event itself. So given all these possible complications to unhealthy anger that is an effect of being treated unjustly, is there a cure for unhealthy anger or this resentment or this irritability? The answer actually scientifically is yes. The practice of forgiveness, when a person is treated unfairly by others, indeed can reduce or even eliminate this excessive anger, which others call irritability or resentment, and the subsequent effects that might include anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and even hopelessness in the future. So if that's the case, if forgiveness is a cure for this unhealthy anger that tumbles into the heart following injustice, what do we mean by forgiveness? What is it? Well, one thing I like about forgiveness, it is a choice. I have a book called Forgiveness is a Choice, not a demand or a grim obligation, but it's each person's free will decision to go ahead and engage in this moral virtue. Aristotle taught me that a couple thousand years ago. He said the idea of what he called magnanimity of heart, that we call forgiveness today, is a moral virtue, as is justice and patience and kindness and love. And any moral virtue is goodness that starts within a person and is deliberately nurtured inside a person to give away for good to other people. Justice, for example. If you're a carpenter and I contract with you to build a table for me for $200 and you do that, you give me the table, I give you the $200, I have exercised goodness toward you, you have exercised goodness toward me because we've honored the contract, and that's a moral virtue. So when we talk about forgiveness, what I also like about it is it cuts across most of, I would say all, of the ancient belief systems I have been able to study as an egghead professor at a university. So I have looked at the meaning of forgiveness in the Hebrew culture, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and there is a thread throughout all of these that is tied together across all of these historically and culturally. And there are 3 points to the definition of forgiveness that I think all of these early ancient systems would agree. And here are the 3 points. First, when we forgive, we try to, well, first of all, we've been treated unjustly by others. That's the first step. Second, we try now to get rid of deliberately. It is a choice that's motivated. It's not that we just take a forgiveness pill and then that's the end of the resentment, but we are motivated to get rid of resentment or persistent ill will toward the person who acted unfairly toward us. It is for that person. And then here's where forgiveness gets controversial, but if it's a moral virtue dealing with goodness, when you and I try to forgive others, we strive as best we can to offer goodness of some kind to the ones who have hurt us. And this goodness can take the form of kindness, respect, generosity, or even love. And what I find interesting about this, especially relative to Eva Moses Kor's own heritage of Judaism, the very first mention of person-to-person forgiveness in written form in the history of the world, as far as I can tell, came from the Hebrew scriptures. Joseph forgiving his half-brothers in Genesis 37 to 45, where they tried to murder him, threw him down a well, changed their mind, and what did they do? Did they dust him off and say, "Come home, bro"? No, they sold him into slavery in Egypt. But once they were there and then came back again, and he put them in prison and played a trick on his full brother Benjamin, he eventually embraced them without their even apologizing because they didn't know he was Joseph. And he lavished, there's that magnanimity of heart from Aristotle. He lavished on them goods and food and animals to save the Hebrew nation from famine. And so the very first mention of forgiveness anywhere in the world comes from Hebrew scripture. And it shows how very, very important forgiveness is, because the Hebrew nation was struggling mightily because of famine, and Joseph's forgiveness actually helped save the Hebrew nation. That's how important forgiveness is historically. But there are some issues that are misunderstood regarding forgiveness. There are 4 here I'd like to discuss with you. Forgiveness is not excusing what the other person did. Joseph never would have said, oh, it's okay that you threw me down a well to murder me. It's okay you sold me into slavery. No, all of that was bad, is bad, and it will always be bad. But he had goodness toward them nonetheless, not excusing the event, not excusing the injustice itself. We don't forget when we forgive because we rarely forget trauma. Instead, we remember in new ways. When we look back and we know the person's weakness, so we don't fall into the trap again, we remember without the rancor, without the fuming, without hatred. So we can remember what happened without that big ball of anger developing in our heart again. And when people forgive, they may or may not reconcile. This is one rap against forgiveness, where people will say, Enright, how dare you tell me to forgive? First, I don't tell people, I suggest it. But how dare you even suggest it to me? Because now you're telling me to go back into an abusive relationship, whether it's a partnering relationship or a boss-employee relationship. You're going to get me killed by talking about forgiveness. Well, no. Forgiveness as a moral virtue is very different than reconciliation, which is not a moral virtue. Reconciliation is when 2 or more people come together again in mutual trust. You can forgive by offering goodness to somebody, but then watch your step. Be careful. If someone's a compulsive gambler and keeps asking for $100 a week and they've depleted your bank account and they're not paying it back, you might forgive for the hardship, but lock your checkbook up and not reconcile in that way if the person continues with the compulsive gambling. You can forgive without necessarily reconciling. And you can forgive and seek justice at the same time. If someone keeps hitting you over the head with a frying pan and you have a big lump on your head and you're angry about that, you can indeed forgive the person and grab the pan and say, let's talk about this. Let's be fair to one another. So as you forgive, you are not caving in and letting the other have the other person's way. You are forgiving from the heart and watching your back at the same time, when forgiveness and justice grow up together. So when people actually engage in this moral virtue of deliberately trying to be good to those who are not good to them, what's the evidence from science, what we call randomized experimental and control group clinical trials, that forgiveness improves well-being? What's the deal here? What happens? Well, I'll just quickly share with you 4 studies that we have done, and they've been all published in peer-reviewed journals. And the first one is by Suzanne Friedman and me. And Suzanne was a student of mine. She's now a professor at the University of Northern Iowa. And she and I are both going to be keynote speakers at a forgiveness conference at Bar Ilan University in Israel on February 1st and 2nd. So I hope to see you all there, Bar Ilan, okay? 1st and 2nd in Israel. Get your plane tickets now. And with the study that Suzanne did, she worked with incest survivors, one of the cruelest injustices on the planet, because a father or father figure who is supposed to be good to the daughter and protective is actually violating. It's much worse than, let's say, being robbed in Central Park by a masked marauder who we don't even know. And we worked with 12 incest survivors. 6 went through the forgiveness program one-on-one for an hour a week until they said, I have forgiven. And Suzanne worked with them. And on the average, it took about 54 weeks, a year, more than a year, for each of them to forgive. The control group participants waited that year. And at the end of that year, keep in mind that all of them came to us clinically depressed. And at the end of the year, those who went through the forgiveness program not only improved in depression, they went to non-depressed status. What of the women, the 6 women who were waiting, and they had their own therapy as they wished for that full year? They were still clinically depressed. Suzanne then had them go through the forgiveness education program, one-on-one, an hour a week for about a year again. They also went from clinically depressed to non-depressed. It remains one of the strongest, if not the strongest, set of results of healing in a mental health way from the ravages of incest ever published. That one was, I'd say, transitional in the social scientific field in getting people's attention. Those who were skeptical about forgiveness, to their credit, began to see that science is showing there's something to this. Then Gail Reed and I worked with emotionally abused women who were divorced for at least 2 years, and they also were clinically depressed. Think about that. They were already divorced, leaving that very toxic marriage behind for 2 years, and they still had the effects very strongly in them. Gail Reed met with those who've been abused in the experimental group or the forgiveness education group, and they also went to non-depressed status. And those in the control group had an assertiveness training that has been shown to be effective, but it was not nearly as effective. The people in the assertiveness training didn't decrease as did the ones in the forgiveness education in anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and in increasing self-esteem. Because one thing we find is that when people have been beaten down by others, do you know who they end up not liking? Themselves. I wish the world didn't work that way. Well, when people are beaten down, they sometimes believe the lie. Forgiveness builds up the self again. You get a whole person inside of you again when you forgive. We've worked with cardiac patients who, in screening them, had trauma against them years before. And oftentimes it could have been in childhood or even adolescence. And these were adult males on a cardiac unit of a hospital. And one thing about anger and the heart, when there's heart compromise, the arteries to the heart begin to narrow when a person is very, very angry. And we had the men retell their story of hurt while they were hooked up to the heart monitors, and sure enough, the arteries started to close more. And so we had forgiveness education for half the group. The other group had heart health as usual in the hospital. And 4 months after the forgiveness education, when we hooked them up to the heart monitors again and said, please tell your story of deep hurt, the arteries stayed more open for those who had forgiveness, but not so for those who had the approved heart health curriculum on the cardiac unit. Dr. Douglas Russell, the physician overseeing this work, said forgiveness education helped these men who had forgiveness education avoid chest pains and sudden death. And the fourth one, we've done many more, but I just want to give you a sense of this. We've worked with elderly cancer patients, all women, who were in hospice dying of cancer. And we only had a 4-week program here because they were weakened and their physical indicators were going down. But after this 4-week program of forgiving, even though they continued going down in terms of the physical indicators, their emotional well-being was going up, including hope for the future. How could that be? They're passing away. How could their hope for the future go up? Because many of them drew their family together to their bedside And they talked about forgiveness and reconciliation. And they knew they were leaving their family in a better position than would have been the case. And here's just one more to show that we have cross-cultural evidence. We did a study in South Korea with at-risk adolescent females. And those in the experimental group who had the forgiveness education showed a significant decrease in anger, what we call hostile attribution toward others, lower aggression and lower delinquency, and actually increase in their academic achievement relative to those who did not have forgiveness education. So there's one more evidence that it's not just a Western phenomenon, it can be a cross-cultural phenomenon as well. So forgiveness matters as a way to get rid of this big ball of anger when treated unjustly. How do you do it? How do you go about forgiving others? Let's take a look at what we call our pathway of forgiveness, or our process model of forgiveness. And remember, this pathway took the incest survivors a year. I'm going to be showing it to you in 15, 20 minutes. So you can get a sense of the movement in this pathway of forgiveness, but you would have to spend time on it to really get benefits from it. So the preliminaries are to choose one person who has hurt you and be sure there really was an injustice rather than a misunderstanding of some kind. And oftentimes I ask people to choose someone with whom they're not hugely angry, to learn the pathway first and then build up to the one who has been really terribly unfair to you, because you have to become what I call forgivingly fit. And that takes a while, it takes practice. So we have 4 phases. The first phase is what we call the uncovering phase, which is basically uncovering the anger that is built up from the injustice and all that tumbles into this anger. And a lot of times people, if I say on a 1 to 10 scale, when you think about what happened to you, give it a number. 1 is just very, very mild anger and 10 is enraged. A lot of times as a person goes in forgiveness education, the number goes up because the defenses of denial and suppression break down. And the person says, I'm angrier than I thought. And that's okay because forgiveness is a cure for anger. So the person has a safety net. So then they're oftentimes more willing to admit there's more anger than they realized. Another effect from being treated unjustly is shame. And the shame is you want to hide under the bed because others are judging you. If you're fired from a job, people whisper, well, what did that person do? Well, maybe the boss went bankrupt and it wasn't your fault, but people whisper anyway. Or you have a breakup with a partner and people say, what did that person do to cause the problem? And you might have done nothing. But when people are judging, that's another very uncomfortable effect. And sometimes when we live with anger for a long time, it does affect our health, as we saw early in the earlier slides. But the most common physical complaint I see is fatigue, being tired. Because if you have this big ball of anger in your heart and you're carrying it around all the time, even if it's suppressed, it's still there, your energy level is compromised. And if you have 10 points of energy to get through the day, you might use 3 of those ruminating on the issue, thinking about it and having this emotion that is bringing you down. And so fatigue is the biggest one in terms of the health issue. But another one that is subtle and people often miss is a changed worldview. And by that, I mean, the person ends up becoming much more pessimistic in life. The glass is always half empty. Trust is damaged. So if you have a breakup with a partner and you're really, really angry and you're not getting rid of that anger, you might have a hard time trusting others. And there might be a perfectly good partner for you waiting for you. And you can't trust that person because you still have the residuals from what happened in the past. And so you're thinking Well, everyone's always out for themselves. It's all about power, not love in the world. I can't trust anybody. And then people who might have been a person of faith drift away from faith. Sometimes I talk with people and then they blame God for the injustices against them. But I try to bring them back to earth and the concrete issues. They're saying, well, was it God who willingly stole from you? No. Would God have willed that? No. And so there's a tendency to blame everyone but the person. And so I try to bring the person back to the reality. There are people in this world who act badly. And if that's the case, if you want to blame someone for now, blame that person. And the point is to try and reconstruct a worldview that's healthy and wholesome and good for you. And then we hit the decision phase of forgiveness. The decision phase is like opening the gymnasium door, saying, I decide to become forgivingly fit. And so if you decide to do that, we go over what forgiveness is. You'll get rid of resentment toward the person when you're ready. Offer goodness. You won't be excusing, forgetting. You won't necessarily reconcile, but you might. And you won't abandon justice. You want to start. You want to try it. And most people do, because when they look at all those effects from the slide right before this, they say, nothing I've tried has worked psychotherapeutically. I'll try forgiveness education. And so we give a homework assignment. Try to do no harm to the one who hurt you. Try to do no harm. In other words, you might not talk disparagingly about the person to family members, okay? Or if you meet the person, you won't deliberately try to be mean to the other. And so once we enter the gymnasium door of becoming forgivingly fit, we do the work of forgiveness. Phase 3 is work on forgiveness. And we start with thinking rather than feeling, because it's much harder to feel soft feelings towards someone who's brutalized you than to think good thoughts. We have 3 kinds of thinking perspectives: personal, global, and cosmic. In the personal perspective, we take a look at the woundedness of the one who wounded you. Oftentimes we know who the person is because we tend to be hurt by family members and close associates more than distant strangers. And so if that's the case, we ask, what was it like for this person growing up? Did the person get wounded or confused or frustrated as a child? How about as an adolescent? How about as an early adult? How about the woundedness this person might have been carrying when the person wounded you? You see, we're trying to expand the narrative, expand who the person is. So you begin to see in forgiveness, this person is more than those particular actions against you. The global perspective asks a more abstract question about humanity. Is this a person? Is this a human being? In other words, for example, does this person have unique DNA, where there never was another person like him or her and never will be again, unless the person's a twin, an identical twin? The answer is yes, this person is unique. Well, that makes the person special and irreplaceable, just like you. Do you realize you share humanity with this person? You share being special, unique, and irreplaceable. You share, therefore, built-in inherent worth that cannot be earned. If that person cuts, that person bleeds. If you get cut, you bleed. You need good nutrition. That person needs good nutrition. You need good rest. You both will die one day. You both are human. The person is more than those actions. The person has built-in worth that cannot be taken away. And then only if a person has a spiritual perspective do we go to the cosmic perspective. Otherwise, we leave it at the personal and global. But the cosmic perspective is what we call the transcendent perspective. Let's say the person is Jewish with whom you are working in forgiveness education. You can then ask this question: is it true that the one who hurt you is made in the image and likeness of God? Look at Genesis 1. It says it right there. All people are made in the image and likeness of God, and it's repeated in that very same chapter. So drum roll, please. We ask, is it true that the one who hurt you is made in the image and likeness of God? And a lot of times people swallow hard and say, "Oh, I wish I didn't know that." But when they take time on this, they realize, oh, that person is made in the image and likeness of God. And then we ask, are you made in the image and likeness of God? You see, that begins to recover self-esteem that was broken down by the unjust event. Oh, I'm made in the image and likeness of God, and so is the other. So what is your now expanded story about who this other is, in addition to the actions against you that were very hurtful? Oh, the person's made in the image and likeness of God, is special, unique, and irreplaceable as a person with inherent worth, and has a lot of woundedness and confusion. And out of that woundedness probably came this discontent that wounded me. I was an unsuspecting victim of what happened to that person maybe years ago. And you put that all together and you begin to see someone who's vulnerable, who is hurting. And when you see that hurting person, you begin to soften the heart a little bit toward that person, which is the next bullet point. Compassion is a willingness to suffer along with the person, even if it's a little tiny bit. But you see, even a tiny bit of softening of the heart is the beginning of chipping away at the big ball of anger in the heart. And the more you expand your story of the other through the personal, global, and cosmic perspectives, the more this chips away, this big ball, until it reduces and reduces and reduces. And you have a softened heart toward this person, where you say, this is a suffering person, like Joseph did with his half-brothers who were starving. You see, his heart went out to them. He had a softened heart to those who wanted to murder him. And then once a person gets strong enough through a softened heart and sees the other more broadly, do we ask the person to accept or bear the pain of what happened? This is a paradox. Think of it as a sponge soaked with water. It looks like that water will never go away. It's there, it's saturated, but if you leave that on a counter, unattended, the water eventually evaporates until you have a dry sponge. It's the same thing when you bear the pain or accept the pain and stand in the pain for the other person. You realize that that pain isn't going to crush you. You realize you are stronger than you thought you were. And the first social scientist to actually talk about bearing the pain in psychotherapy was Morton Kaufman from Israel. He would have his patients bear the pain of what happened so they don't take it out on others. One very good football player, soccer we call it in the United States, was very upset with his father, and he would disrupt his own team by taking the anger out on the team. Dr. Kaufman asked him to stand in the pain for his father, and he eventually became a good teammate and a good son. Okay? And only when a person is strong enough to bear the pain do we then ask the person to exercise forgiveness in its true sense as a moral virtue when ready. Remember Suzanne Friedman's work. This took close to a year before they were ready to give something good to the one who was unfair to them. And it might be a smile, a returned phone call, an email, a kind word about the person. If the person's deceased, you might donate a little money to charity in the person's name. Right? And so there are ways to be good to others, even at a distance, when you cannot reconcile with someone. One person in Suzanne Friedman's study fed her dying father in the hospital. And she said, I'm really glad I did that because he is my father after all. And when he passed away, I would have mourning, even on some level, but now I would also have hatred. I don't have that now. I have mourning without the hatred. And so she was very thankful that she ended up forgiving. After all this work in the forgiveness gym, we start seeing that we've learned something from walking the forgiveness path. We start finding meaning in our suffering. Viktor Frankl who was a psychiatrist following in Sigmund Freud's footsteps, was in the Auschwitz concentration camp where our dear Eva Moses Kor was. And he was, of course, obviously abused there. And he said, I found two kinds of people in Auschwitz. One was a kind of person who found meaning in their suffering. One thing Eva did when she was there is she was attending to others who were imprisoned with her to make the world better for them. She was finding meaning in her suffering. The other kind of person, according to Viktor Frankl, were those who found no meaning at all to their suffering. They just say, you live, you suffer, and you die. He said, they didn't live long. They ended up passing away early. Finding meaning in what you've suffered can include a willingness to help others, even if you're not a mental health professional. For example, I worked with one man who was in medium security prison, who's going to be there for many years. And he said, I'm not getting out of here anytime soon. But now that I've learned the forgiveness process, my new way in life is helping my cellmates to overcome the tragedies in their life. So not only does he find meaning in his suffering, he also has a new purpose. And that purpose is to alleviate suffering, because he understands the suffering in himself and he understands the suffering in other people, you see. So he's attuned to that suffering. And being attuned to that suffering, now he is able to help others. And a lot of this incest survivors, by the way, in Suzanne Friedman's study and the study we did, surprised me, because a lot of them said they want to dedicate their lives to helping others incest survivors. And that last bullet point is what we call discovering the freedom of forgiveness. And in other words, what's lifted is the big ball of anger, the anxiety, the depression, which you saw in these other studies, the incest one, the one of divorced women for at least 2 years, and there have been others. And so you are released from the emotional prison. So at the end of the day, at the end of a year, at the end of your life, you will have two possible roads I want to mention, and it's about your legacy. What will you leave behind in this world when you die? I'm not talking about leaving the rocking chair to the grandchildren or the bank account to the spouse. I'm talking about the intangibles. Will you leave behind for others your inherited discontent, your anger and your hatred, which can be passed down through generations, by the way? Or will you leave your sense of goodness, your sense of love, your sense of purpose of making a better world through forgiveness? We're at a crossroads when we have a broken heart, and we can leave our anger, but we also can leave instead a legacy of love, which Eva Moses Kor left for all of us. So I have a little treat for all of you. I want to share with you a 7-minute video that Eva Moses Kor made for our International Forgiveness Institute. I think none of you have ever seen it before, and I want to give this as a gift to Candles, and I want to give it as a gift to Alex Kor, who also had to put up with an awful lot in life, because he too had the scars of Auschwitz handed to the family, unintentionally, of course. And so I want to give this to you, Alex, as well. And so I'm going to play the 7-minute video of forgiveness education. And I asked Eva to make this for me in 2017. So I'm going to be bringing it to Israel when I'm there again in February, where she talks about forgiveness education, not for the adults, but for the children. So let's see if I can get this started. And if not, I'm going to need help from Troy or Trent. And there we go. Let's see. I thought I started it. Let's try this again.
I have come to the conclusion that And I am convinced that forgiveness is actually the only way to get to peace. By forgiving, we are sowing seeds of peace everywhere. For a very, very long time, probably 50 years, I was angry with the world, and I was a very, very good victim. Somehow, I was lucky enough to discover that interesting idea that I had the power to forgive. That was to me an amazingly important discovery. And then I realized that probably most victims in the world never discover that secret and go on holding on to their pain, being angry, and the victimizers are long gone. They never really cared. They did what the wrong that they did, and then the victim remains with all the pain and dies suffering. So when I realized that, and since then that's been now 22 years ago, I also learned that there are many, many victims in the world from all troubles, genocides, of course, the Holocaust, other genocides in Rwanda and in Somalia and in Darfur, and we can name all these places. But everyday people, just living their everyday life, are suffering. And now talking, I am addressing the people in Israel, I am addressing the Palestinians, I am addressing the Christians, the Jews who live there, and they all have very rich traditions. And the traditions are wonderful. But when the teachers, the parents, the religious leaders pass on the traditions, I would like them to pay attention to the fact that they do not pass on or teach the anger, the pain, and the suffering. Because if we teach that to the young people, they are going to be angry, they are going to hate, and the two sides will never, each one holding on to their own tradition and brand of hate and anger, will not get together with the other side. And if we took them as individual human beings, and I believe that every human being wants to live without pain, wants to live in harmony, wants to live with love and caring, and that is what we should pass on to them. That should not be an honor to hate somebody. It should not be a tradition that passed on, that I'm going to kill anybody who is different. That is not, and the children are burdened with that brand of tradition. So if we could leave out the pain, the anger, and the suffering, I think the children would learn very well the tradition, but they also would learn that they can love their neighbor, that they can forgive each other. That forgiveness is so basic to liberating one's soul and one's mind, that opens the doors to peace. Therefore, the reason that I say that forgiveness is a seed for peace that every person can practice. It would be even nice if we could cover some of the mountains in Israel with little flowers. We could call them peace flowers, that the children could plant them together. And that would be their way of remembering an active thing to participate in peace. At the same time, plant the idea in their hearts and in their minds that they each child, Palestinian, Israeli, Christian, Muslim, Jews, they can all come together in harmony, liking each other for what they are and for what they can do together. Even though they come from different backgrounds. When I look at a Palestinian child, an Israeli child, a Christian child, if they were dressed the same, could we tell them apart? No, they are three children who deserve a life in harmony, in goodwill, in peace, so they could flourish. And what a wonderful idea that would be. But that is what we have to teach our children. And so tradition, yes, pain and suffering, no. Love, yes, hope, yes, hatred, no. And maybe we should have slogans with posters on the wall. Love, yes, hate, no. So if they could visualize it. But it would be an interesting thing if the children wore all exactly similar clothes. Could you tell if they were different religion? No. Could you tell if they were different nationality? Not really. So that is what the world needs. I think it would be a wonderful beginning for a road to peace. It is possible, it is viable, and it's absolutely necessary for their future and the future of the world.
Thank you, my hero, Eva Moses Kor. I'm going to stop sharing now.